Hey, what's up, VC? It's Steve again, Harmless Rebel, and it's time for another quick video. This one is going to be about death metal. Something I don't talk about that often, but I got into death metal probably a couple years late, but still early in the death metal scene. Probably about late 93. Mid to late 93 is when I first got into death metal. I was aware of a lot of the death metal bands. I already knew about Death. I was already aware of Carcass. Some of the bigger bands, especially the grindcore bands, just because I was listening to a lot of punk in the early 90s, and a lot of my gutter punk friends were starting to get into grindcore, and they were into the crust and then moving into grindcore. So I heard little bits here and there of death metal, but I just wasn't there yet. I was still listening to a lot of thrash from the 80s and early 90s. I was listening to a lot of the Seattle stuff, especially Alice in Chains. At that time, it was my favorite band by far. Still is in a lot of ways. It's still one of my favorites. But then I ran across, and I'm trying to think exactly what album was first. But I'm about 90% sure that it was Necroticism from Carcass. I remember going to Zia, and if you're from Arizona or Nevada or one of the surrounding areas, you've probably seen Zia before. There were a lot of record stores in Phoenix at the time, and there still are. They're everywhere. They always have been. But most of them carry just kind of the common fare. They had a little bit of death metal here and there, but not too much. If it was something that was charting on the metal charts, they may have a copy. But Zia was different. Zia brought in all this really obscure stuff from all over the world. They really relied on their employees, and they hired really hip on music, and not hipster, but they hired really hip employees that were bringing in some really cool music. And I was at a listening booth. They had a heavy metal listening booth set up, and I ran across Necroticism, and I absolutely love it. I was blown away by how good it was and how different it was. So I grabbed that and I listened to that nonstop, and that was really my intro to death metal. And that, of course, would lead me to, I should have put these in order. That would, of course, lead me to this album, which came out right around that time. This came out a few months after I got into death metal, but that led me to Heartwork. And most of these, I've talked about before. I sold off most of my CD collection in 2005, 2008 timeframe. Most of it actually back to Zia, which is funny. I kind of completed the circle there because about half of it came from Zia. But all my death metal stuff was in a little leather-bound case that got lost. And because of that, I didn't find it until I moved here to Georgia in 2012. So, for a good 7 or 8 years, it was just lost in boxes. And that's the only reason I still have all of my original copies of these albums. But that led me to Heartwork. And I don't remember, I had the Heartwork EP too, and I don't remember which one I got first. But I absolutely fell in love with this album. I couldn't get enough of it. And I love Necroticism too. This one was obviously more melodic. Now, a lot of people say that the melodic death metal sound came from the Gothenburg bands, In Flames, and I can't think of the other bands off the top of my head, but this came out a couple months after that. Necroticism, though, there's a lot of melodic death in there. A lot of people like to still call that more on the grindcore side, and there is some of that. But they were playing with melodies in that album, and then they kind of came full circle with this one. But I actually think that Necroticism was really the first melodic death metal album, and I'm sure I'm going to start an argument on that, especially if you're a hardcore. A lot of people, that was the end of Carcass for them. They liked Reek, They liked Necroticism, and then this came out, and then they were off the wagon. I absolutely love this album, and this was hugely influential for me, not just in my musical journey, but at this time I was playing in bands. I was in my first band, Siege, and especially the drum work in death metal, and that's really what led me to death metal. Was I was a drummer. You know, unlike a lot of people, I wasn't looking just for heavier, more aggressive sounding music. For me, it was about the drums, and I loved the sound of the drums, and that's kind of what dragged me in that direction. And with albums like this, you could still be super heavy, but still have a melodic drum beat in the background, which I thought was really cool. And then from there, I went on and picked up this one. This one is not. This is an original. This is a repress from 2009, I think. A lot of people hate this album and talk trash about it. I still think this is a great album. It's definitely more melodic than anything that they would release or had released to that point and would release. I still love this album though, but Heartwork is really the one that did it for me. And before I get any further, you know, the tag here is 20 death metal albums. I think I'm going to come up short by a couple of albums. Just because I've got a lot more than 20 death metal albums, obviously, but a lot of the stuff that I have is newer. And when I say newer, I mean more late 90s, early 2000s. And that wasn't really instrumental in me getting into death metal, so I didn't want to pull those out and just show them for the sake of showing them. And obviously, and also you'll notice that Death is missing from this. While I love Death now, and they're still, they're one of my all-time favorite bands, I was really late to Death. They just weren't in my sphere of what me and my friends were listening to at the time. And it's nothing against Death. Again, they're one of my all-time favorite bands. They just didn't have that really aggressive death metal sound that I was looking for at the time. They were more thrash-based, which is something that I love about them, and more technical, which is, again, something I love about them. But at that time, that just wasn't what I was looking for. So I had heard some of their stuff, but not enough to go out and buy any other album. I think the first album I heard from them was Spiritual Healing. And although, again, I love that album now, it just didn't do anything for me back then. And after hearing that, I didn't really listen to any other stuff until years later. It was probably the late 90s when I really got into Death. And sadly, right when I did get into Death, I was in Japan, and it was at a point where it was too late to go and to see the band. And then, of course, Chuck unfortunately died before I moved back to the U.S. But I would love to have seen them live. So Carcass was the first really big band that I got into back then. The next one, and although this is another one that's not my original copy. I picked this one up a few years ago. Actually, that's the wrong one. And unfortunately, it's the censored album cover. It's not the censored music, that's one of the funny things about this band. So this is Cannibal Corpse, and they offered the censored album, which really didn't make sense because most of the time you couldn't understand what was being said anyway. And then they also offered the censored album cover. But this album, you still got Barnes on vocals. I actually like Corpse Grinder's vocals better. I've never been a huge fan of Barnes' early vocals. Back then, I thought it was kind of cool, his really low guttural vocals. Now it doesn't do much for me, so I rarely revisit this album. But this is Tomb of the Mutilated. And actually, it was Hammer Smash Face that got me into this album. I don't remember how I ended up with a copy of it. It may have been my buddy Shane. I want to say that he gave me the single for Hammer Smash Face, which was like 2 songs from the album, maybe a live track. I'm just spitballing. I could be completely wrong about that. But it was a Hammer Smash Face single, and I really dug that. So I ended up going out and buying the album again. Now this is the censored cover, which is still a pretty gnarly cover, and I really dig that even the censored covers, they still did some really cool artwork with it, Unlike another one, and this is one I got into years later. This came out, I think, 96 or 97, but this is all early stuff. Let's see. Now, it's stuff going back to 89 through 95, but Wake Up and Smell the Carcass. When this came out, I wish this is my original copy of it, but I wish that I still had the original CD cover, because the CD was all black. It was just a black cover, and it had a not a black sticker like a lot of them will have. This part of the booklet, or this part of the jewel case, was actually black plastic, so you couldn't see through it at all. And it had a little sticker on it that said "Carcass, Wake Up and Smell the Carcass," censored, and of course it's John F. Kennedy. So I do like the fact that they kind of did this on their censored cover, as opposed to doing something like this where the whole the plastic was all black and you couldn't see anything. So but again, Hammer Smash Face got me into this. And although I've got a lot of Cannibal Corpse albums, I've got 5 or 6 of them, I've always liked Cannibal Corpse musically. Lyrically, though, I mean, it's just always been silly to me. And not that I got into a lot of these bands for their lyrics, but, you know, just trying to out-gore everybody. I don't know, I just always thought it was silly. These next couple I picked up around the same time. And again, these are all original copies here that I've had since then. But next up from 1990 is Master, their self-titled album. And this album is awesome. I actually just listened to this before I did the video. I love this album beginning to end. This is my favorite Master album. I've got 2 or 3 other albums up there. I don't have this one on vinyl, unfortunately. But everything on here is amazing. And they do a really killer copy of a really killer version of Children of the Grave on here as well. And that by itself is worth the price of admission for this album. If you run across this is one I highly recommend picking up. Then the next one, this next album is one that got a lot of people into death metal. I know a lot of, and I've seen it on a couple of these videos, but I know a lot of people have gotten into death metal because of this album and the follow-up album. And I'll show both of them because I actually got both of them on the same day. And I couldn't get enough of them. This is another one I gave another listen to this morning because I haven't listened to this in years. Again, this is my original copy on RC Records. This is Cause of Death from Obituary. And man, they were so good. And honestly, after this, and I've also got my original copy of The Incomplete, I love these 2 albums to death. I couldn't get enough of them. I played them over and over again. But then I just lost interest in Obituary. I really didn't like anything that they put out after these 2 albums. I did later get into what was not their newest album that just came out within the last couple weeks, but the album that came out a few years ago. I really dug that too, and that really brought me back to these 2 albums. But I didn't really like their first album either. I didn't like their debut. But Cause of Death is the one that did it for me, and I was just hooked. I couldn't get enough. Like I said, I went out and bought the shirts. You know, I was waving my Obituary flag high. This next one, again, original pressing. This is actually probably the most valuable CD that I have in my collection. I may have one that's worth more, but I doubt it. This thing still regularly sells for $75 to $100 for the CD. The CD actually sells for more than the original LP, which I always thought was weird. But this is Dark Recollections from Carnage. Another just killer death metal album. Amazing artwork. And this is pretty melodic too. Not a lot of blast beats, and I mean this is really good stuff. And you've got Mike Amott, or Amott, I don't know the right way to say his name. Of course, he also played on Necroticism. He also played on Heartwork. Oh, who would he go on to? He would go on to form another band that I'm a big fan of, and I can't, Arch Enemy. So he's remained in the scene and kept really busy, and he did some other projects too. But this is where it started. This was, and I'm trying to think. One of the other guys went on to form another major band too, but. Dark Recollections is a great album and one I highly recommend picking up. You can get the represses for $8-10. You're not likely to run across this, but if you ever do, man, if you ever run across a copy of this where the Carnage is in small print across the bottom here, and it's got the all black lettering, grab it. Like I said, they go for $75 to $100 all day long. These are really hard to find. They were really limited pressing here in the U.S. There was a UK pressing that was more you could find all over here in the U.S. too, that had this album, and it was a split. It had this full album and the full album from another band all on one CD, and that still goes for $40 or $50. But that was the one that made the rounds, and then there was a real limited pressing done here in the U.S. Next up, Atrocity. This is one I highly recommend picking up. This is probably one of the darkest albums I've ever heard. Atrocity, I don't know how much, if they did anything after this. I never really looked into the band that much. But this album, it's one of the first technical death metal albums. And it's amazing. I'm trying to think what year this was. I want to say it was 90. Yeah, 1990 is when this came out. It came out around the same time as the first Atheist album. I think they both came out within a couple of months of each other. But man, not only is this amazing technical death metal, the lyrics on this are just ridiculously dark. This is it's all about addiction, which is a little different than what every other death metal band was doing at the time. You had Cannibal Corpse doing the rape and mutilation. You had Carnage and half the other bands doing the satanic stuff. You had Carcass doing the medical the medical terminology and all that crazy stuff, but they took it to it. I mean, this was real stuff that people were dealing with, and it's not just, hey, I'm addicted to drugs. This is like dark, the imagery and the insanity that's going on. And man, killer album, and one I highly recommend picking up. This next one, this is the first CD that scared the shit out. A lot of people talk about they like death metal they like black metal because it makes them feel uncomfortable. And I've never felt that way about black metal. There's a lot of black metal I like, especially the early black metal. But and it was dark and it was raw. And I know a lot of the newer stuff, it's more atmospheric. I hear people say, oh, it sounds like it was filmed or it was recorded with the tape 50 feet away in the middle of a forest. I hear all these crazy albums and stuff. And honestly, I think black metal to the point, and I know I'm going to offend a lot of people because I know how big black metal is in the VC. A lot of it just sounds the same to me, and it's to the point where a lot of the stuff that's coming out kind of bores me. Whereas I really like the early stuff where it was all new. And the death metal is the same way. A lot of the new death metal just bores me too. It's just different ways of rehashing the original stuff. But none of those albums really scared the shit out of me like this album did. And it's Once Upon the Cross from Deicide. Again, this is my original copy. I didn't know what I was getting into with this album. I had heard that Deicide was satanic, which, I didn't really think nothing of back then. And now, knowing, what's the main guy's name? Glenn Benton. There we go. Haven't seen interviews, and the guy's a nutball. One day he's satanic, he really believes in Satan. The next day he's an atheist. I think it's like a lot of these bands. I think it just kind of depends on the trend. you know, back in the 90s, Satanism was a really big thing. So everybody's like, oh, we believe in Satan. This is about our Lord Satan, you know. And nowadays, everybody's an atheist. So now all the bands are saying, you know, we're not really talking about Satan. We're talking about the idea of Luciferian thought, you know. And it's the same bands from the 90s just saying different shit, you know. Oh, we were never really satanic. We just don't believe in anything. And we use that as our condemnation of Christ or our condemnation of religion or whatever, you know. This is the first thing, though, that I really heard where, you know, there's one of the songs, Kill the Christian. What was Kill the Christians was one. The song Once Upon the Cross. I mean, if you read the lyrics of this stuff is dark and fucked up. More dark and fucked up than any of the shit that most of the black and death metal bands have ever written. And man, at the time when this came out, I thought I was being cool and rebelling, you know. And honestly, DSI, they're great musicians, but this shit is dark. I can't fucking listen to it anymore. But it definitely had its place back then. Next up, this was the first Napalm Death album. I still love this album. This is the one I listened to the most. I did go back and listen to their earlier stuff, but when I'm in the mood for some Napalm Death, this is what I listen to. And this is Fear, Emptiness, Despair. And just a killer album. If you're just looking for a good album from the early 90s, man. Oh, this is I think 93 or 94 when this came out. This album kicks ass, though. And this is the band that found their sound. They were tight. I like Scum. I like their early stuff. But, man, this is the one that does it for me. And then in the background, this is a little bit later. I think this came out in 97. But this is a comp of the band's early EPs. So this is still some of the earlier stuff from the band. But this is Entombed. And just another band that I was really into at the time. Some other really important CDs at the time that I don't have anymore. Once Upon the Cross, or no, I'm sorry, now I got that on my head. Blessed Are the Sick from Morbid Angel. The song Fall from Grace is still one of my all-time favorite metal songs. Everything about that, the intro is one of the sickest death metal intros that I've ever heard. I also like Altars of Madness, but I didn't hear that one until 4 or 5 years later when I finally ran across a copy. But Blessed Are the Sick was huge. I also bought Covenant when that came out. I didn't like that one as much, and I really haven't liked anything else from Morbid Angel. But that particular album, Blessed Are the Sick, really did it for me. And Altars of Madness is an absolute classic as well. Some other albums that I really got into at the time that really had an effect on me were one of the Gorefest albums. I don't remember which one it was. It was one with just the GF on the cover. That's all the big ones. So what I do? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I showed about 13 albums and talked about another 3 or 4 mixed in there. So, you know, about 14. So I'm not going to meet the tag of 20. And it just comes down to, you know, number one, back then I didn't have a lot of CDs. I didn't have a lot of money back then. You know, 93, 94, I was in high school. I was also a gigging musician. So any money that I had was going into my drum kit. It was going into whatever we needed for our PA system or whatever the case may be for our shows at the time. So, you know, a lot of this stuff I picked up used at Zia, and that's the reason I got it. But I maybe had 30 or 40 CDs total back then, which is probably a lot compared to the average person. You know, I just didn't have a lot of CDs. I had a bunch of mixtapes and stuff. I would borrow stuff. I shouldn't say mixtapes, but I had a lot of stuff that I copied onto tape. But just not a lot of money for CDs back then. So I probably didn't have 20 death metal CDs back then, and a lot of this stuff was stuff that I got into over a couple year period. So, but that really was the stuff that got me into death metal, and this is the stuff that I still go back and listen to. Like I said, I've got a lot of newer death metal stuff, but when I'm really in the death metal mood, you know, I'm going back and listening to Atrocity or Carnage or Obituary, especially. The Master I listen to pretty regularly, so that's really the stuff that I go back to. I don't, you know, a lot of the newer stuff I'll listen to once or twice, and it's pretty good. But again, it just doesn't have that effect on me that the early stuff did, or Death, obviously. You know, I listen to a lot of Death, especially now that they're re-releasing all the stuff on vinyl. But and I have very few of these on vinyl, unfortunately. I would love to get all of these on vinyl, but you know, maybe someday as they're repressed and stuff. But, oh, you know what? I'm actually skipping a couple. I do have a couple more. This is another one that I got into relatively early, and I didn't like it when I first heard it because it was too fucking slow. It drove me nuts. And then over time, I really got into it because it's still really heavy and still sounds amazing. I don't have my original copy of this. I had this on tape back in the day, but I did run across this copy on vinyl for like $10 a couple years ago. And this is Mental Funeral from Autopsy. I didn't really get into any Autopsy's other albums. This is the one that did it for me. And the reason I got into it was I thought it had the coolest fucking artwork that I had ever seen. And this one is on red vinyl. But I ran across this, like I said, for $10, and I couldn't pass that up. And then actually, I forgot about this. This is actually the album that led me to death metal. I was already very heavily into this band, which I've talked about dozens and dozens of times. And it's Sepultura. And I was already, Chaos AD was already one of my favorite albums at this point. And then I was looking at, I don't remember what magazine it was. It may have been, I can't even think of what magazine I was looking at the time. But they had an article called something like Meeting Death Metal or Getting to Know Death Metal or something like that. And it showed 10 albums that they said were mandatory listening. And a couple of them I showed. The Carcass was one of them. Obituary was one of them. I want to say Cannibal Corpse was one of them. And then this album was one of them. And being Sepultura, I hadn't gone back and explored their earlier stuff yet. But it was Beneath the Remains. And this is an original... What pressing is this? Pretty sure this is an original US pressing. I can't remember now. But this is on RC Records. But Beneath the Remains. And I've talked about this a number of times. It's still one of my favorite Sepultura album is Schizophrenia. Number 2 is probably Beneath the Remains. And that was the one that really kind of led me to experimenting with necroticism and going that route. But that was a huge one. So that's it. This video went on way too long. I hope all is good. Take care, everybody, and I'll see you soon.